They never put them in the textbooks. They never carved their faces onto currencies. They never named the great libraries after them. But while Europe was still arguing over who held divine right to a throne, these women were commanding armies, outmaneuvering empires, and bending the most powerful men on earth to their will. This is not mythology. This is not legend. This is documented, verifiable history, and it has been buried long enough. For centuries, the story of power has been told in a very particular way. Kingdoms in Europe, monarchs in white marble palaces, men in golden crowns deciding the fate of the world. The African continent in those same centuries has been reduced to a footnote, a place history happened to, not a place that shaped history. That version of events is wrong. Across the African continent, from the sands of Egypt to the highlands of Ethiopia, from the forests of Nigeria to the plains of Angola, women held power that European monarchs could only dream of. They led armies into battle. They negotiated with empires. They built cities. They refused to kneel. In this video, 5 of those women take their rightful place in history, measured not by myth, but by documented record, by archaeological evidence, by the accounts of their own enemies who were forced to write about them because they could not ignore them. Stay until the end. The 5th Queen's story will permanently alter the way you understand power, gender, and the ancient world. If this kind of buried history matters to you, subscribe now, because there is far more of it where this came from. In the northern region of what is today Nigeria, the Hausa kingdom of Zazzau produced one of the most formidable military commanders in African history. Her name was Amina, and by the time her story was over, she had spent 34 years in active military command, conquering territory, expanding her kingdom, and building fortifications that still exist in the landscape of northern Nigeria today. Amina was born around 1533 into the royal house of Zazzau. From childhood, historical accounts recorded in the Kano Chronicle describe her as exceptional, a girl who sat in war councils before she could hold a weapon, who watched her grandfather command soldiers and understood even then that power moved through armies. She refused marriage. Multiple suitors came forward, chiefs, warriors, rulers. She declined them all. When asked why, the oral traditions of Zazzau record a woman who had a singular answer. She had no intention of being governed by anyone. At the age of approximately 16, she received her own unit of soldiers as a gift from her mother, Queen Bakwa Turunku. She trained with them, she studied logistics, troop movements, and the tactics of siege. When her brother Karama took the throne and then died after a short reign, Amina assumed command in 1576. 3 months after becoming ruler, she launched her first military campaign. It would not be her last. For the next 3.5 decades, Amina marched her forces south and west, extending Zazzau's territory to the banks of the Niger River and as far as the Nupe and Kwararafa kingdoms. Historians credit her with opening trans-Saharan trade routes that brought enormous wealth into the Hausa states. Every conquered region paid tribute. Every captured town added soldiers to her ranks. Her military signature was the construction of walled camps at every new territory she seized. These walls, known today as Amina's Walls or Ganawar Amina, are still visible across northern Nigeria. Some stretch for miles. They were not symbolic, they were strategic, fortifications designed to hold ground, to project power, and to make clear to every neighboring ruler that Zazzau was not retreating. Now consider this. In the same decade that Amina was leading cavalry charges across West Africa, Queen Elizabeth I of England sat on the throne in London. Elizabeth was a formidable political ruler,
of that there is no question. But Elizabeth did not command armies from the front. She did not sleep in military camps. She did not personally lead her forces into battle. Amina did, every campaign, for 34 years. The historical record of Amina's reign does not describe a figurehead. It describes a general who happened to also hold a throne. In the early 16th century, the Portuguese Empire was one of the most powerful colonial forces in the world. It had carved up coastlines, enslaved populations across 3 continents, and routinely dismantled African kingdoms that stood in its way. Most African rulers, faced with the Portuguese expansion, negotiated from a position of weakness and lost. Nzinga Mbande of Ndongo did not negotiate from weakness. She never did. Born in 1583 in the Kingdom of Ndongo in what is now Angola, Nzinga was the daughter of King Angola Kilwanji. She was trained in statecraft and military strategy from an early age, and by the time the Portuguese began their aggressive encroachment into Ndongo territory, she was already her father's most trusted advisor. In the early 1622, Nzinga was sent to negotiate with the Portuguese governor in Luanda. It was a high-stakes diplomatic mission. Her kingdom's sovereignty and the freedom of thousands of enslaved Ndongo people hung in the balance. What happened in that meeting became one of the most documented and studied episodes of African diplomatic history. The Portuguese governor offered Nzinga a mat on the floor, a deliberate act of humiliation designed to signal her inferior status. She surveyed the room, said nothing, and gestured to one of her attendants. The attendant got down on all fours. Nzinga sat on the attendant's back and conducted the entire negotiation at eye level with the governor. She did not come to be diminished. She came to negotiate as an equal, and she forced that equality through sheer will and preparation. The Portuguese, reportedly stunned, proceeded with the talks. But diplomacy was only one of Nzinga's weapons. When it became clear that the Portuguese had no intention of honoring their agreements, that they would continue raiding Ndongo for enslaved people, regardless of any treaty, Nzinga shifted to war. She allied herself with the Dutch, who were rivals of the Portuguese. She absorbed the neighboring kingdom of Matamba, transforming it into a military base of operations. She organized and commanded guerrilla forces that harassed Portuguese supply lines and settlements for decades. She ruled and fought into her 70s. The Portuguese never succeeded in conquering her. In 1657, she negotiated another treaty, this time from a position of demonstrated military strength, and spent her final years governing a stable, sovereign kingdom.
Compare her to King Louis XIII of France, who ruled during the same period. Louis spent much of his reign dependent on Cardinal Richelieu to manage his nobility, his finances, and his foreign policy. He struggled to maintain authority over his own court. Nzinga held 2 kingdoms together against a colonial empire, fought that empire to a standstill, and died in her bed at 80 years old as a sovereign ruler. By 1900, the British Empire controlled roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface. Its armies had conquered kingdoms across Asia, the Americas, and Africa. Its governors administered their territories with the certainty that resistance was futile, that the combination of industrial weaponry, professional soldiers, and imperial logistics was simply too overwhelming for any local force to oppose. Asantewaa had a different view. She was born around 1840 in the Ashanti region of what is now Ghana. She rose to become the Queen Mother of Ijisu, a position of genuine political authority in the Ashanti system, where Queen Mothers held the power to appoint and depose chiefs. She was a respected elder, a custodian of Ashanti tradition, and, when the moment demanded it, a military commander. That moment arrived in 1900. The British governor of the Gold Coast, Sir Frederick Hodgson, summoned Ashanti leaders and made a demand that was not merely political, but deeply sacred in its violation. He demanded that the Ashanti hand over the golden stool. The golden stool was not a piece of furniture. It was the spiritual and political soul of the Ashanti nation, believed to contain the spirit of the Ashanti people, never to be sat upon, never to be surrendered. The Ashanti chiefs gathered to discuss their response. Many hesitated. Some argued that resistance was impossible, that British firepower made open war suicidal. The meeting stalled in fear. Asantewaa stood up. The words she spoke that day were recorded and preserved. She told the assembled chiefs that if the men of Ashanti would not take up arms to defend the golden stool, then the women would. She said the women would fight the white men until the last of them fell. She called the hesitation of the chiefs a disgrace to the memory of Ashanti ancestors who had never bowed. The chiefs rose. The War of the Golden Stool began. Asantewaa commanded the Ashanti forces. She organized a siege of the British fort at Kumasi that lasted months. British reinforcements had to be sent from Lagos and Sierra Leone to break it. It was one of the most determined military resistances the British faced anywhere in West Africa during the colonial era. She was eventually captured and exiled to the Seychelles, where she died in 1921, never having returned to Ashanti soil. But the British never obtained the golden stool. It was hidden and it survived. And in Ashanti tradition, she is remembered as the woman who made the British earn every inch. Queen Victoria, who sat on the British throne during much of the colonial period, was undeniably powerful. But her power operated through ministers, admirals, and generals. She never stood before a council of frightened men and shamed them into courage. Asantewaa did, and then she led the campaign herself. In 1896, the Italian army marched into northern Ethiopia, convinced that it was about to complete what every European colonial power had accomplished across the African continent: the subjugation of an African kingdom. Italy had deceived Ethiopia into signing the Treaty of Wuchale, a document whose Amharic and Italian versions said completely different things. The Italian version granted Italy a protectorate over Ethiopia. The Amharic version said no such thing. Emperor Menelik II rejected the treaty. Italy decided to take Ethiopia by force. They were about to walk into the worst military defeat suffered by a European colonial army in African history. And the woman behind the strategy that made that defeat possible was Empress Taytu Betul. Taytu was born around 1851 into a noble Ethiopian family. She was Menelik's fifth wife, and by virtually every contemporary account, including those of European diplomats who met her, the dominant political intelligence in the imperial court. Ambassador Pietro Antonelli wrote about her influence with barely concealed frustration. He understood that when Taytu spoke, policy moved. It was Taytu who identified the deception in the Treaty of Wuchale's Italian text. It was Taytu who argued most forcefully in the Imperial Council that Ethiopia must reject the protectorate and prepare for war, rather than accept a diplomatic fiction designed to erase Ethiopian sovereignty. When war came, she did not stay in Addis Ababa. She personally accompanied the Ethiopian army to the front, commanding a force of approximately 5,000 soldiers and organizing water supply for the surrounding forces, a logistical role whose importance to the outcome of the battle military historians have increasingly recognized. She understood that wars are won not just in combat, but in supply, in water, in food, in the coordination of forces across difficult terrain. On the 1st of March 1896, at the Battle of Adwa, the Ethiopian forces destroyed the Italian army. Roughly 7,000 Italian and Eritrean soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured.
It remains the only decisive defeat of a European colonial army by an African force during the scramble for Africa, the most significant military victory on the continent in that entire era. Taytu's contributions did not end with war. She personally chose the site of Addis Ababa and directed its founding as Ethiopia's new capital, a city that today houses over 5 million people and serves as the headquarters of the African Union. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany ruled during the same period. He led his nation into a catastrophic world war that ended with Germany's defeat, the collapse of his empire, and his abdication and exile. Taytu helped win Africa's greatest military victory and founded a capital city. The comparison does not require elaboration. Before going further, one fact must be established because it has been obscured by centuries of European portraiture and Hollywood production design. Cleopatra VII was an African ruler. She was the Queen of Egypt, a civilization located on the African continent, rooted in African geography and connected through millennia of history to the civilizations of sub-Saharan Africa and the ancient Nile corridor. She was, yes, of Macedonian Greek descent, but she ruled Africa. She governed from Africa, and her power was African in its base and its reach. She was also something no other ruler in the ancient world, male or female, managed to be. Simultaneously the most desired ally and the most feared adversary of the Roman Republic, the most powerful military and political entity on earth.
Cleopatra VII was born in 69 BC and assumed the throne of Egypt as a teenager. She was the first ruler of her Ptolemaic dynasty to learn the Egyptian language. All her predecessors had governed Egypt for nearly 3 centuries without bothering to speak to their subjects in their own tongue. She also spoke, according to the ancient historian Plutarch, 8 additional languages, including Ethiopian, Hebrew, Arabic, and Parthian. She was not merely a monarch, she was a scholar, a linguist, and a strategist. Egypt, under her rule, was the wealthiest nation in the Mediterranean world. It controlled the grain supply that fed Rome. The Roman Republic, which commanded the most powerful army in the ancient world, was, in a very practical sense, dependent on Egyptian food. Cleopatra understood this leverage and used it. Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt in 48 BC as the undisputed master of the Roman world. He left having aligned himself completely with Cleopatra's political agenda. He supported her claim to the Egyptian throne against her brother-husband, Ptolemy XIII, went to war on her behalf, fathered her son Caesarion, and brought her to Rome, where she lived openly as her partner. After Caesar's assassination, the 2 most powerful men who emerged from the wreckage of the Roman Republic were Mark Antony and Octavian. Cleopatra aligned with Antony. She met him at Tarsus in 41 BC in a display of such calculated magnificence documented by Plutarch in extraordinary detail that Antony, a battle-hardened Roman general, was rendered a political subordinate. He followed her back to Alexandria. He reorganized the Eastern Roman territories in ways that benefited Egypt. He named her children as rulers of Rome's eastern provinces. For nearly a decade, the de facto capital of the Eastern Roman world was Alexandria, Cleopatra's city. When Octavian finally defeated Antony's forces at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Cleopatra did not wait to be paraded through Rome in chains, a fate reserved for conquered rulers who survived defeat. She died by her own hand in 30 BC, in full control of that final act. Octavian, who became the Emperor Augustus and rewrote history to his own advantage, was reportedly furious. He had planned the spectacle of her humiliation. She denied him.
No European monarch of any era held equivalent geopolitical leverage.
No medieval king, no Renaissance prince, no crowned head of Europe commanded the grain supply of a continent, aligned the loyalties of the world's two most powerful generals simultaneously, or played Rome against itself while governing the Mediterranean's richest kingdom. She did not kneel to Rome. Rome came to her. 5 women, 5 kingdoms, 5 different centuries, and one consistent fact running through all of it. The historical record, when examined honestly, does not support the idea that power in the ancient and medieval world was the exclusive domain of European men. Amina of Zazzau spent 34 years in military command and built fortifications that still stand. Nzinga of Ndongo fought a colonial empire to a standstill and died sovereign at 80. Asantewaa shamed an assembly of chiefs to courage and led a siege that forced Britain to call in reinforcements from across West Africa. Taytu Betul outmaneuvered Italian colonialism in a council chamber and then organized the logistics of the battle that humiliated a European army. And Cleopatra VII held the Roman Republic hostage through the control of grain, the mastery of language, and an understanding of power so complete that 2 of Rome's greatest men restructured their careers around her interests. These are not stories that require embellishment. They do not need mythology layered onto them. The documented record alone is extraordinary enough. What they required, and still require, is someone willing to tell them. If this video changed the way you think about African history, about women in power, or about the stories that have been deliberately left out of the mainstream, share it. Put it in front of someone who needs to see it. The algorithm buries this kind of content if it doesn't move. You can make it move. Subscribe if you haven't already. There are more chapters of buried history waiting, and the next one is already in production.